Does anyone remember the imagery of a field that we used in the first episode in our Judges series? We said that God's people, Israel, were coming into a country called Canaan, and we imagined it as a field that had the potential for a huge harvest. Do you remember that? But we said there was an issue. The potential for the harvest was huge, but before they could hope of that harvest, they had to clear out the thorns and the snares that were currently in the field. Is this ringing any bells? All right, good. So fruitfulness was possible, but the thorns have got to go. The snares have got to go. If you've got Judges open, turn back to Judges chapter 2. And if you look at verse 3, you get the language there that says, I won't drive them out before you. They will become traps. That word is actually thorns for you. And their gods will become snares for you. The image there is that the unbelievably wicked people who are currently in the land will do you unbelievably wicked harm if you do not justly remove them. Thorns have got to go. The snares have got to go. That was chapter 2. We're now in chapter 8. And we've said the whole way through this book that Judges is like a cyclone of chaos that doesn't just go round and round, but it goes down and down. And so here is what is worse in today's episode. Here is how deep things have degenerated. It is not just that thorns and snares are coming from the outside, from their enemies. It's that thorns and snares are coming from the inside amongst God's people. People that ought to have been united, fighting the enemy together, are fragmenting and fighting each other. It is heartbreaking and it's shocking given what just happened in the previous episode. Do you remember how the Lord gifted victory to his people last week? Do you remember this tiny band of 300 soldiers were gifted the victory over the vast Midianite army? And we were told the Lord threw them into confusion, and this was the language, chapter 7, verse 22, causing the Midianites to turn on each other with their swords. All right? Infighting. But in the light of that battle where the enemy turned on each other with their swords and destroyed each other, today the Lord's people now begin to turn on each other with swords and destroy themselves. That's why it's worse. The Lord's people become thorns in each other's side. The Lord's people become snares to each other's hearts. And this is the word of warning that we're going to feel today. Fighting amongst the Lord's people is inevitable when the Lord's people forget the Lord. And so we're going to work through the episode in two bits. Here's the first one. We're going to read chapter 7:23 to 8:21, and here's the headline. The Lord's people become thorns in each other's side. Let's read chapter 7, verse 23. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, they're all tribes within the Lord's people, were called out and they pursued the Midianites. So, although the majority of the Midianites was destroyed last week, there's this small band of about 15,000 men who have now fled. So, verse 24, Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-bara. So, he's trying to cut off their escape route. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-bara. They also captured two of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. We think so far so good, but listen out for this first round of infighting. Chapter 8, verse 1. Now the Ephraimites, another tribe, asked Gideon, why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian? And they challenged him vigorously. So here's this tribe who are fuming because they weren't invited to the fight. This is a kind of macho-fueled FOMO. If you're missing out. So Gideon answers, verse 2. What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midian leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you? At this, their resentment against him subsided. Now, Gideon's answer there, that is smooth. That's a savvy political answer. But it wasn't the Lord's answer. Do you remember the Lord's why to those kind of questions last week? The Lord said, I don't need more men, I need less. Because this isn't about showing your strength, it's about me showing my strength. And so although Gideon's answer is political and it works, he's not actually telling them God's answer to their problem. I think already we're seeing Gideon becoming godless. This is the beginning of backsliding. Now, look at verse 4. Gideon and his 300 men, having just pacified this one tribe, exhausted yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Succoth, give my troops some bread. They're worn out. And I'm still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. That seems like a really reasonable request, doesn't it? An army marches on its stomach. So surely the Lord's people will feed the Lord's army. Verse 6. But the officials of Succoth said, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops? I didn't like Gideon's answer to the previous tribe. This is more political BS, where they're basically hedging their bets, trying to work out which side is going to win, and then they'll side with them. Will it be the Lord's people, Gideon, or might it be the Midianites? So verse 7, presumably a pretty hangry Gideon replies, just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. You know what's that phrase? That's the loaded killer phrase. What is Gideon going to do to his own people? He's going to be a thorn in their side. The Lord's people are becoming thorns in each other's side. Instead of feeding, there's fighting. Instead of brothers sharing bread, they've become foes who are threatening thorns. And as thorns do, thorns spread. Look what happens in verse 8. From there, Gideon went up to Peniel and made the same request of them. So it's the same thing. Will the Lord's people feed the Lord's army? But they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he's had two tribes, no nosh. Verse 9. So he said to the men of Peniel, when I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower. Do you remember last week, Gideon was hacking down the idols? Do you remember his name meant hacker? Well, this week, rather than what was used for the Lord's purposes in the last episode, they are going to be used for being against the Lord's people in this episode. The Lord's people are becoming thorns in each other's side. Look at verse 10. Now Zebah and Zalmunna, these are the two kind of remaining enemy kings, were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that was left from the armies of eastern people. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbetha and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. Why do you think he's done that? Well, he caught a young man from Succoth, and that's the first tribe that refused him food. Questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth. The elders of the town. Why do you think he wants those names? It's not for Christmas cards, is it? Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men? He took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. So what do you reckon he's done? Presumably taken the thorns, turned them into a whip, and he has lashed these men to teach them a lesson. But whatever he's done is ugly, isn't it? It is tit for tat. It is thorn for thorn. And again, if you compare this to the last episode, and like if you remember Deborah and Barak, after the Lord gives victory, the Lord's people unite together and they sing the lyrics of the deliverer Deborah. But instead, this time, the people are in disunity, screaming under the lashes of a pretty godless Gideon. And having brought revenge to the first type tribe, he moves on to the second. Verse 17, he pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. For the refusal of bread, all the men dead. Swords have been turned on themselves, and the Lord's people are thorns in each other's sides. Verse 18, then he asked Zebah and Zalmunna, What kind of men did you kill at Tabor? Men like you, they answered, each one with the bearing of a prince. Gideon replied, Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As sure as the Lord lives, if you'd spared their lives, I would not kill you. Now I think those words reveal a lot about what's going on. Within Gideon, a switch has happened, where he's no longer simply pursuing the Lord's will, but he's pursuing his own personal vengeance. And you can totally understand it in him, but you are watching it unraveling him. Look at what he does next. Verse 20. Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, Kill them. Good parenting. But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. It's pretty grim reading, isn't it? Verse 21. Zebah and Zalmunna said, Come on, do it yourself. As is a man, so is his strength. So Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments off their camels. So, the enemies are put to the sword, but it's a sword that Gideon has already turned upon his own people. It's a total mess. But in many ways, it's so us, isn't it? There are churches where this is exactly what goes on. People who ought to be united together are thorns in one another's sides. Maybe you've been in churches that feel like that. Maybe you're in a marriage that feels like that. Once you just smelled the rose, now you only feel the thorns. The Lord's people become thorns in each other's side. And this is how deep this cycle has descended. Here's the good news. In the second half of the chapter, things only get worse. We go from the Lord's people are thorns in one another's sides to the Lord's people become snares to each other's hearts. And that's chapter 8, verses 22 to 32. So let's keep reading from verse 22. The Israelites say to Gideon, Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Now, that is an interesting take. You have saved us. That's a bit of a reach. You could get away with saying, the Lord saved us through you, but if you're going to put the emphasis on one, you put it on God, not Gideon. We've seen already Gideon's becoming a bit godless, but now the Lord's people are becoming lordless. And that's definitely the case in their request for Gideon to be their king. Rule over us. Now what's amazing if you read the Bible, you see how it fits together. God had predicted this keenness for a king. And so he had put some standards in place. And the first standard God laid down was this. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. But what's going on here? The people's choice is completely lordless. He's not invited into the equation at all. He's not consulted. He's not asked. He's not depended on. And what we'll see is by offering a crown for Gideon's head, maybe unsuspectingly, they are actually putting a snare around Gideon's heart. Now, listen to Gideon's reply at first. Verse 23. He's asked to be their ruler. Verse 23. Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Now, that's got the ring of a great response, hasn't it? You're looking, good lad, Gideon. Get God back in the game. But just wait. Just listen. Because what he's just said with his lips is immediately undercut by what he does in his life. Look at verse 24. And he said, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. So what's going on? He doesn't want the king's crown, but he does want the king's cup. He says, no, you need to be God's subjects, but he immediately wants a sign that they are subject to him. You can see his heart's been snared. Verse 25, the people say, we'll be glad to give them. So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw in a ring from his plunder. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels. That's 43 pounds, or 20 kilograms. So put them in gold. Not counting the ornaments, or the pendants, or the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on the camels' necks. So again, he said with his lips, I don't want the title of king, but he's acquired for himself the treasury of a king. Look at verse 27. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. Now, an ephod was probably the most elite, the most exclusive item of clothing in all of Israel. There was only one of them, and it was only to be worn by one person, the high priest. And when that one item of clothing, ephod, was worn by that one man, the high priest, he became the one place of judgment in all of Israel. So what is Gideon doing by making another one? By making his own one. His lips might have said, I don't want to be king. But everything about him is saying, I want to be more than king. I want to be king and priest and judge. His heart has been snared. And, as always happens, ensnared hearts have a tendency to ensnare others. Look at the second half of verse 27. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Gideon's pride becomes the snare for their prostitution. And it's a tragic picture where the very person God had given to lead them into victory is now the man who is leading all of God's people into idolatry. So verse 28, thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and didn't raise its head again. So the enemy's gone, but there's an enemy within. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. But what does Gideon do in that peace? Keep reading. This next paragraph, by the way, reads as if Gideon is winning at a bingo card at everything God says a king shouldn't do. So verse 29, Jerubbaal, son of Joash, that's Gideon, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. That's a mark on the bad bingo card. Verse 31, his concubine, basically a live-in sex slave, another mark on the bingo card, who lived in Shechem, meaning she was a Canaanite, another mark on the bingo card. also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. I didn't know what Abimelech meant until this week. Do you know what Abimelech means? It means, my dad is king. So here's the man who said with his lips, I don't want to be king, has a little boy and calls him, my dad is king. It's tragic, isn't it? So verse 32, Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And you're left going, I thought Gideon was a good guy. He's so not. In fact, he seems to end the story worse than he started. Gideon was saved from Midian only to be ensnared by his own heart. Last week he was tearing down idols. This week he's building his own idols. He seemed to learn the lesson that weakness is a good thing. Now he's depending upon his own strength. He seems to say, I don't want to be king. But then he seems to become the king of messing up everything. Worse and worse. Round and round. And that's the end of Gideon's life. So, after 2 episodes and 2 weeks, let me try and draw 2 conclusions from the life of Gideon. Here's the first one. The Lord is unbelievably gracious. We've spent a lot of time looking at Gideon's flaws, his faithlessness, and his feebleness. And the portrait that you're left with is pretty hideous. Started hideous, it becomes more hideous. But for all the things we can look at him and condemn him, the surprising thing is that later on in the Bible, he is commended for his faith. If you've got a Bible, turn to Hebrews chapter 11 and have a look at Hebrews 11, verse 32. Hebrews 11:32 says this, what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell you about Gideon. Right, so we're talking about Barak, we talked about last week, Samson, Jephthah, we'll get to them. About David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of the lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword. And then this bit, I think, is a bit about Gideon, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Look down at verse 39. These were all, Gideon included, commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. So despite all the things that we could condemn Gideon for, the Bible commends him for his faith. And you could go, what? How can such a hideous portrait be hanging in heaven? Answer. The Lord is unbelievably gracious. Gideon's there not because he was good. Gideon is there because of God's grace. Almost every single detail in the Gideon story is there to demonstrate to us that we are not saved by our own strength, by our own good works, by our own things that we have supposedly done for God, or by anything that we deserve. It is only ever by the unbelievable, undeserved kindness of the Lord. Gideon was not a great man of God. He was just a man with a great God. a man with a gracious God. A God who doesn't treat us tit for tat, thorn for thorn, but a God who in his deliverer Jesus bore the thorns in the desert for us. A God who in Jesus tore down the curse of my imperfections and then rebuilds in me the blessing of his perfection. So if you're here today and like me, you see yourself in the weakness, the feebleness, the faithlessness, and the godlessness of Gideon, you need to allow Judges to jolt you into putting your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And it is not the strength of your faith that saves you, it is the grace of the one you put your faith in. And that is what means that there can be something better for us rather than just descending down into deeper and deeper darkness. Gideon was not perfect, far from it. But one day, together with those of us who have faith in Jesus, he will be made perfect forever. And so though you share his flaws, the most important thing is you share his faith. The Lord is unbelievably gracious, isn't he? Here's the second lesson. As well as being unbelievably gracious, in chapter 8, the Lord is shockingly absent. Shockingly absent. We worded the warning at the beginning like this. Fighting amongst the Lord's people is inevitable when the Lord's people forget the Lord. In the previous episode, chapter 7, the Lord was so present working salvation for his people. In chapter 8, he is shockingly absent, seemingly forgotten by his people. In chapter 8, whenever the Lord's name is used, it's being used in vain. It's not being valued. And if his name is on their lips, it's being disproved by what's done in their lives. And the spoils of a victory he has won are being used to worship themselves. And in the light of a very kind of recent rescue, instead of together living under God's rule, everyone says, let's just do what's right in our own eyes. And so inevitably, everyone becomes thorns in each other's side and snares to each other's hearts. Here it is in a phrase. Forgetfulness of him ignites fighting within. That's what chapter 8 verse 34 says. If you go back to Judges, Kenny's going to look at this more next week, but verse 34 says, they did not remember the Lord their God who had rescued them from the hands of their enemy on every side. It is forgetfulness of him that ignites all this fighting within. And so if you're in a place, or if we ever get to a place where the unity of our church dissolves, or if the cohesion in your marriage has completely crumbled, here are the types of things we need to ask ourselves. Have we functionally abandoned the one who united us together? Are we taking the lives that he rescued and then just living under our own rule? Have we subtly switched agendas from living for one another to just doing what I think is right for me? Have we stopped hacking out sin and instead started just hacking down each other? Are we saying to the Lord things like, my career isn't king, but then actually we're saying, my career is king? Are our choices pretty godless? Is our day-to-day pretty lordless? And we live in such an individualistic society that we can say, well, if I just do what's right in my own eyes, it just affects me. Judges is here to say, no, it doesn't. We, by whatever we do in right in our own eyes, become thorns in the side of others and snares to each other's heart. And the Lord Jesus has some serious things to say to people who cause other people to stumble. Sin is never solitary. So we need to listen and learn that if we abandon the one who unites us together, then we will be left by not much that holds us together. If we are not all fighting the same battle, we will very soon start to fight one another. Come back to that field relationship. If we don't tend our relationship to the Lord, this field will very soon be overwhelmed by thorns and snares. But He's got us listening to His word today because He wants us to fight against forgetfulness. If forgetting the Lord is what ignites infighting, then remembering Him will be the water that brings reconciliation. We can sometimes be so focused on thorns and snares that we begin to get to a place where we think good fruit isn't possible anymore. I got a message from a guy this week who said, I'm back on it. I am not sure that there is any hope for me. You know, the truth is, if you are close to God, good fruit is inevitable. His grace brings growth. His grace can save us from that inevitable or seemingly inevitable slide into our imperfections. And His grace can unbelievably empower you to walk closer to the perfection that you will one day be in Jesus. But what needs to happen today? We need to fight to remember Him with more energy than we fight with one another. Knowing that His unbelievable grace can prevent this shocking